Well, not moving the bus much, so I've been putting off what I needed to get done. And one of those things I need to do is replace the seal on the alternator. These oil-cooled Delco Remy 50 DNs tend to have seal leaks over time. As you can see here, my alternator has a leak. It's not a bad leak. Certainly seen much worse than this. Generally, it's a little difficult to tell whether or not this is actually a seal leak or a gasket leak. So the first thing to do, as you can look down in here, you can see the bolt sitting right there. So the first thing to do is get a wrench in there and snug them up a little bit in hopes that it's just a gasket leak. If that doesn't work, which it didn't in this case, it's on to replacing the seal. Well, I decided to take the alternator physically out. You don't really need to do that to replace the front seal, but with the paint work I'm doing, it's best to take it out. So what's involved in taking this out? Well, we can see here we have the large battery terminal. We have our field connection going to the voltage regulator. Both of these have been disconnected at the other end before they're disconnected here. And yours may actually have this relay connection as well. So that will be our 3 potential electrical connections. On a few of them, there's actually a ground cable that comes off of them as well. And then the other connections we have to take off on the bottom, right here, this is an oil return line. So that line will have to come off. There's 2 bolts underneath here. We have this line right here. This line here has to come off. So that's one line. And then on the other side of it, or in the middle, there's actually 4 mounting posts. Here, here. And then we'll move around to the front. We need to take this breather line off right here. And this will show you where the bolts are on this one. Well, as you can see, the alternator has been removed. Really wasn't that big of a deal, except for that drain hose has a huge connector on it. So it might be a wrench they don't typically have. Maybe even larger than most crescent wrenches. But while this is out, before I forget, one thing that's very important to realize. You can see right there that there's a tab sticking up. You'll see one of those on one side of the front, and you'll see that tab on the other side. Now, what's important about that is those are alignment tabs, so that the alternator sits correct front to rear, making it easier to bolt in. But if somebody were to set the alternator on top of those tabs, not paying attention, and then tightening it down, that's likely how you do see some of these alternators that the feet are broken off in the middle, probably because they were tightened down on top of those tabs rather than the alternator sitting in them. Well, here you can see that we've got the front pulley off. Actually, it was pretty easy to do if you use an impact wrench, even though Delco tells you not to. Once the nut is removed, the pulley simply pulls off. No effort at all to pull that off. Now to take the front cover off. Well, this is the seal housing. That's the position it was in. As you can see, clearly the seal had failed. So, to take this seal out is quite easy. Doesn't take anything more than a chisel and a hammer and just a little bit of work on it, and it'll come right on out. All right, now with everything off, first thing that goes on is this ring right here. Put a little axle grease on that before you put it on. The next thing is the cover, and as you can see here, actually put a little gasket sealant on one side of that gasket so that it doesn't move around when I put it back on. And that's going to be the next thing that's actually going to be put on here. Well, as you can see, the retaining ring is back on. The seal has been inserted. And then this is the last piece, this collar that has to go on before we put the pulley on. This doesn't really have a direction. Both sides fit the same, but you can tell by looking at it which direction it should go. It goes on an O-ring that sits up inside there. This will get some grease on it, inside and out. It'll be slid into place.
You'll certainly want to understand what parts you'll need. Well, Delco has several different parts kits. One that comes with a complete set of gaskets, and the one that's illustrated on the right-hand side. It's actually probably the best kit to get. That one includes everything necessary to replace the seal. But the advantage to that one over the one that I used is that the seal comes in a new cap, so you don't have to worry about removing and replacing the seal. Delco also has, illustrated there on the left-hand side, is a complete end cap replacement. This end cap does not have that end that holds the seal, but rather the seal is directly into the end of the unit. That eliminates one potential source of leaks. Of course, that one takes a lot of work to put in. The alternator is certainly going to come out, and you've got bearings to replace. When you go to put this back together, that nut that holds the pulley on actually comes off pretty easy with a impact wrench, even though Delco says not to use one. And that gets torqued down to 225 pounds. When you go to put that nut on, do realize it is directional and that it has a pinch point, which you can see there on the right-hand side, that allows it to lock into place. You can't turn that nut over and put it on the other direction first. And then that cap, the one with the 6 bolts that holds the seals, those bolts are only torqued about 5 pounds, so don't over torque those. Now, if you removed your alternator, which is not required, you will be removing the electrical connections. So when you're doing that, make sure you disconnect them at the other end so that you don't have any shorts. When you're in there wrenching, some of those installations, it can be kind of tight in there. If you paint your alternator, which I did, make sure that you adequately mask the insulators around each one of those terminals. With most electrical things, you'll want to use dielectric grease when you're reinstalling that bonding strap. That bonding strap you can see there on the upper right-hand side of the rear of the alternator. And one of the things that you'll also want to make sure of, most converters did this, is to make sure that that big DC cable is adequately supported. That's what that bracket is that you'll see down on the lower section with the 2 holes in it. And then when this gets all put together, that main terminal lug, the one that holds the main DC cable, that gets torqued down to about 30 pounds. You should also put a wrench on the nut that's below the one you're tightening. Now mind you, that's not going to take a standard 3/4 inch wrench because they're just too thick to fit under there. And if you took this off, when you go to reassemble it, there's the 4 bolts that hold the alternator to the engine cradle. That alternator is aluminum. Those bolts are steel. So make sure you use some anti-seize compound on those bolts. If you don't, the next time someone pulls it off, they may very well take the threads with it. We mentioned this before, but it is worth mentioning again, that there are 2 Woodruff keys that are there to position the alternator when you stick the alternator back on the engine cradle. Make absolutely certain that that alternator is flush with the cradle, sitting down on those Woodruff keys before you go to install the bolts. If you don't do so, you could possibly break the feed off, which is not uncommon for those that did not position this adequately.
Well, as you can see here, the alternator is back in its place. Still some work going on because we were doing more than just alternator change. You may also see in there that there's a new belt tensioner. Yeah, of course, taking the belts off, that's the time when you check your pulleys to see how the bearings are in them, and the bearing in that was shot. In fact, let's take a listen.
Well, I hope you can see that changing the alternator seal was not that difficult of a job. And unfortunately, it's a job relatively common on these older coaches with these oil-cooled 50DN alternators. I hope you got some valuable information out of this video. If you liked it, please share, add comments if you'd like, and subscribe to my YouTube channel. Until next time, drive safe, enjoy the journey.